Good morning, everybody. So my name's Heather Leslie. I come from a little country called Australia, just a few hours away. I just happen to be in the neighbourhood. I've been doing some collaborative work with some of our colleagues in Norway, and about to head off and do some work with some of our colleagues in London. So it's all about this same kind of message, it's all this same kind of work, and it's very exciting. In fact, there's more activity around this kind of thing happening over in this side of the world in Europe than there is, unfortunately, at my home country in Australia, but I'm working on that. My background is that I'm a primary care clinician by training. I spent about 15 years in primary care, and I did a kind of transition sideways 20 years ago now into e-health. And so I've been involved as a health informatician now for 20 years and doing this kind of work for the last 10. So in fact, I was very lucky that I got involved in the very early days where we started to take the open-air approach from something that was very much research and development into something that was more real and based on or being used in implementations. So I've been living and breathing archetypes for the last 10 years or so. And strangely, I actually enjoy it quite a lot. Some people think I'm a little bit crazy, I think, but in some people it sort of catches on as something that really is a challenge, bridging between clinicians and the technical people in a way that we can start to develop our health records. So I work for a company called Ocean Informatics, which is based in Australia, and I also have a volunteer capacity in the Open Air Foundation, which is a voluntary role for the non-profit foundation. And in that role, I work with Celia as the clinical program lead. So we are actually involved in herding cats, if you like, to get clinicians and various other domain experts involved in collaborating on these models from all around the world. My day job and my volunteer job kind of merge. It's very much from the whole spectrum, if you like. It's hard to differentiate sometimes. But I hope that some of the passion and some of the excitement that I feel around this work I can share with you today, and perhaps you might go away with a little bit more interest and perhaps a willingness to participate as well. Could I just ask how many clinicians are actually in the room at the moment? Can you put your hand up? Excellent. How many people would say they are just purely technical? Okay, and other people somewhere in the middle are not classified? Okay. Kind of interesting, good. But the clinicians in the room, this is very much for you. This is not a technical thing, so you are able to participate without being technical. That's part of very much what we do. So my first slide here is something that's been been around for a little while. I'm not sure if anyone's familiar with it. I'll give you a second to read it. Someone looking for good quality data. From Florence Nightingale in 1863. So our problem with trying to get quality data is not a new one. We're just trying to do it now in a digital format, which adds to the challenges, I guess. If banks can do it, why can't health? How many people have heard that before? All right. So it should be simple, shouldn't it, as Eric said. But you start to see this list, and you can see I've actually got the dot, dot, dot down at the bottom. I'm not trying to represent all of the various things that we need to do to get electronic health records working by any means. I do just want you to focus on those top three, because that's what I'm talking about today. It's about getting the little data right. That's what I call it, not big data. I'm not so interested in that. It's about getting that little granular data about each little health detail correct and right and clinically appropriate. So that's my focus. This was published in Forbes magazine in April 2013. It's even going back further now. And I quite like it because we've got the big hype cycle with big data. And in fact, this was the first time I'd really seen anybody referring to little data. And I like the fact that we're getting peptic ulcers from trying to get the little data right. And that's very much been the focus, but for me, but not necessarily for everybody else. So it was good to see that in writing. But also point out that some of these phrases I quite like. Clinical data at that unit level is still chaotic and dysfunctional. Right? That's the reality of what we've got out there in the clinical systems at the moment, because every system is building their own back end, their own database. And the other thing that they happen to point out is that the form of that database is usually the crutch in our traditional systems, right? They've built their health record, they say, it's top secret, my back end. My data structure is mine, and it gives me a market commercial advantage, and so I'm not going to let anyone know about it. This is changing, all right? I'll just let you know this is changing. So we are starting to get more open data structures that are being shared, and people are starting to see that that gives them a commercial advantage. So we are seeing vendors starting to collaborate. So why is health so difficult? If you're looking at banks, you might change the interest rates once every 3 or 6 months. There's not a lot that's dynamic in the banking money systems. But if you think about health knowledge, it is huge. It's broad, it's deep, it's complex. And not only that, as Eric alluded to, it changes, all right? It's evolving as we go. We find out more things, we find where we've made mistakes, there's all sorts of things. So we are dealing with a dynamic living entity, if you like. So not only do we have to try and standardise it, we also have to cater for its movement, right? So that's a huge challenge. So for the clinicians in the room, I'm just going to show you a few of these little entries here about how you might try and prescribe a medication, and this is just information about how you would go about timing the medication. So for most of you, it makes sense that you would have it every 4 hours, 3 times a day, 2 times per day, 6 per week, those kinds of things. Does that make sense? That's what your systems would be doing now. And then you start to get into these examples, right, a little bit more complex. And then there's these, and these, and these. I don't think any of our systems can cater for that level of complexity about the timing of a single medication. I'd be very surprised to see any systems that can do it. Most of them can cater for 1 tablet 3 times a day after meals perhaps, and after that they lose it, because this is phenomenally complex. But this is what clinicians do. This is how they prescribe. This is how they need to put something into a computer to be able to write a safe prescription. So there's a mismatch at the moment. Now this is the other challenge that I think is underestimated. Clinicians do things differently, okay? So if you had 2 clinicians in the room, same specialty, same background, they would want to record the same information in a different way, because that's what they've always done with paper records. And so one of the situations that we have is that if a health record is given to the clinician, they're being forced to go down the path of what that vendor has decided is what they need to do. And this is the level of detail, this is the focus, this is the order, all that kind of thing. But at the purest sense, we need a great variety, because clinical situations need variety as well. So the one-size-fits-all health record is not going to fit anybody. And this is the problem that we've got, another tension, if you like, because we have to get the balance of free text with structured data, right? If you give a clinician lots of check boxes, click boxes, drop-downs, they'll go nuts very quickly. But if you give them free text, you're not going to get structured data that you need to drive decision support or that you need for reporting back to government. If you just have the structured stuff, you can't write the subtleties of what's going on with this patient. You know, those subtle nuances that you can't capture with drop-down boxes, okay? So that's a really important thing to consider. What's the balance? We actually need a little bit of both usually. There's the notion of normal statements, right? Clinicians are used to saying NAD, no abnormality detected, or symptoms are not significant. There's all these kinds of phrases that they're used to saying. Everything's normal, I'm moving on to the next bit. So in fact, we now need to be able to let them do those kinds of things. We need graphs, we need images. So the radiologists need a homunculus, right? So they have a body that sits on their paper or their screen, and they need to be able to click on each joint, and they need to be able to say, is it red, is it hot, is it swollen, is it tender? Okay, so that's the way they record. Multimedia, questionnaires, checklists, there's all sorts of things that we need to try and help them with. But the thing that I've found most challenging is actually reflecting the fractal nature of medicine. And by that I mean that the clinicians can stand at the end of the bed and look at the whole patient and want to record something about what they see. All right, the patient's pale or sweaty or jaundiced or something, the skin's yellow. And then they actually zoom in, and then they zoom in, and then they zoom in till they get down to a fingernail or something like that. And we need to enable history taking and examination findings to capture that zooming in notion, because that's what clinicians do naturally, right? And that's not an easy thing to do in a health record. Different clinicians need different approaches, they need different levels of detail. And there's a classic example where I had a conversation with an obstetrician. Have we got obstetricians in the room? I just need to be careful if we do. He was a very arrogant obstetrician, and we were talking about the health record, and he said, there is no way we could use the same health record as a midwife, right? Because we do things differently. We're totally different. We're special, all right? And in actual fact, the majority of the work that the midwife and the obstetrician are doing are pretty much the same. They're recording the growth of the fetus inside the uterus and the health of the mother and the blood pressure and the glucose and the sugar and all that kind of, glucose in the urine. All of that kind of stuff is what they're both doing. So in fact, they've got a lot of their health records are in common. But the obstetrician will have some extra things that are specialised. The nurse may have some things that are more around sort of home care and social support and various nursing-related things. And the nurse may use some slightly different phrases to the specialised ones that the obstetrician might use. But in fact, there's a lot of commonality that's not really understood. So in actual fact, we can use a lot of the same kind of structures for both of these clinicians. It's just there's some subtle differences that we need in the representation and display on the screen more than anything. And my final message there, the one size fits all doesn't fit anybody, so we actually want to avoid that. So the challenge we've got is to turn what clinicians actually do recognise and want to record into some kind of digital format. And that's not easy. All right, this is what we have to do. We're trying to standardise something that is dynamic, that's moving, that's changing, that needs different levels of details, all of that kind of stuff, right? That's why it's not easy to do health. So I want you to suspend belief just for a minute. Some of you might know about this thing called Lego. Has there anyone not heard of Lego? We even have it in Australia. So I'd like you to think of this as a health record, just metaphorically. What we've got there are a lot of structures that are easily identifiable. There's a lot of complex interactions between them, so you've got context and so on that makes sense. Underlying it, you can imagine that we've got, for a city to operate, that we've got sewage systems, we've got police, we've got law, we've got electricity, we've got building codes and all those sorts of things that underpin it. And what I want you to focus on is the actual buildings and structures, because I'd like to use that as a way of trying to investigate, I guess, the health record content. All right, so all of those Lego constructions that you see there, I want you to think of as electronic health record content. So if we zoom in on this a little bit and we can deconstruct it, so I apologise, it's a little bit blurry in the distance. We can deconstruct it and find these various aggregations of the Lego. So we've got a crane, we've got a house, a helicopter, and even a man composed of a few Lego blocks. So I want you to think of those entities in terms of things like perhaps the documents or the reports that fit in the health record. And then if we can deconstruct it further, then we get these individual building blocks. So those yellow and green and white ones and so on, most of those are rectangular or square. They're quite common ones. They're the core ones, if you like, that kids use to build pretty much anything. But then increasingly, we're starting to get the specialised ones. All right, so we've got the Dalek ones for a particular specialised context, if you like, if you're going to get into a Doctor Who building scenario. And then you've got a whole pile of just heads over on the right-hand side. So very specialised blocks that could be, not really standalone by themselves, but could be put on bodies and create all sorts of other entities and so on. So I don't want to push the analogy too far, but you see the components that are broken down from there. And then underpinning this are the rules, all right? This is how the Lego blocks are constructed. There are specifications, there's certain sizes to make sure that the blocks can all fit together. These little buttons on the top have certain specifications so the blocks can fit together snugly, but they don't get stuck. You can always pull them apart again. And if you put them together, they won't fall apart. So they're constructed in such a way that they fit together well. This underpins this underpins this, and this is what constructs the city, okay? So then, in this archetype world that I want to talk to you about, open air, we call this bottom layer the rules, the reference model. These are the things that underpin everything we'll be talking about today. These are in the specifications, they're immutable, they're unchangeable, I can't do anything about them, all right? They are there to make sure that all of the other layers on top will work together. And so on the next level, the equivalent of the building blocks are things we call archetypes. Okay, so these are the individual building blocks that we will then put together. We'll aggregate them in certain shapes to create the templates. So this is the documents, these are the actual components of the documents, these are the rules underneath, and the equivalent is reference model, archetypes and templates. So these two are what you're going to hear about a lot today, the archetypes and the templates. And on top of that, we've got the whole health record, and we've also got a repository, which is a library effectively of all of those archetypes and potentially some of the templates as well. And we have some national programs who are starting to refer to that column there as the info structure. Okay, so we have infrastructure with all of the other things around the health record. This is what national programs are starting to see as the info structure that's required for their health records. All of these things are part of the structure that they're going to need to use. So within the open air space, there's a very clear divide between the clinical and the technical. I don't see myself as a technical person at all. I'm primarily a clinician who's got into the kind of technical space, but I don't understand this stuff, right? This is the stuff that the software engineers are using, and that's what they're able to construct their software independently of the clinical content that I do. But I work with the archetypes and the templates, the building blocks, and effectively the documents, if you like, that construct the health record. And from my point of view, it's a non-reference model, it's a reference model free zone. I don't want to have anything to do with that technical stuff where I can. I avoid it like the plague, and it means clinicians can get involved without understanding all of that fancy technical stuff underneath.
But some of us love it.
Yeah, but that's why I do what I do and you do what you do, Eric. When we work together, that's the magic. So archetypes and templates are the open air models. I've got plus terminology in little letters there only because the heading is open air content models. But in fact, it's the archetypes, the templates and the terminology. That's where the magic happens about how we define the data. All right? So it's not that terminology is minor in the scheme of things. It just is not an open air product itself, if you like. This is where all the content comes from. And this is where our domain experts use their expertise to create the archetypes, all right? And the people like Eric, who's a technical person, don't have to engage with the clinical content. They don't have to try and translate. They don't have to... He nods his head. He understands a bit of it. But this is where we can give quite clear roles, and we don't have to get everybody to understand everything anymore. So clinicians are driving electronic health records. This is the change, all right, because it's often very hard for clinicians to know how to get involved. This is where we absolutely need them, all right? Changing the priorities, changing the focus so that they are leading the way. So let's start to look at the archetypes. We've seen that they're foundation building blocks in that diagram, if you remember. That's a really key notion just to keep in your heads. They're computable specifications for one single clinical concept, right? Archetypes, building blocks, one concept. So something like how we record a blood pressure, a medication order, a symptom, a diagnosis, and so on. The other things to remember, it's a maximal data set, ideally. All right? We're talking about all of the data elements about that one thing, be it blood pressure or medication order. Everything for every use case. All right, so for the blood pressure archetype, it's about the machine that goes on your arm in the bathroom in the morning, through to what the ambulance guys on the side of the road would be trying to do to take a blood pressure through a car window with someone trapped, the machine that goes beep in intensive care, primary care, population health, whatever it might be. Anywhere that we need to represent blood pressure, we want to have all of the data elements in our blood pressure archetype. That's the notion. It's inclusive. It's not the minimum data set where everyone has to fight over what's going to be in there. It's actually saying, bring me all of your data elements and I'll include them. Okay, so it's quite a nice notion. It's quite different to what we've done before. The notion that we design each archetype once and then we can reuse it over and over and over again in different contexts. All right, so it might take a bit of work, and I'll show you some examples where it's taking a while at the moment with some of our core archetypes. But they're the really core things that everyone uses and everyone has an opinion over. Once they're done and agreed, we might have to tweak them, but they're pretty good for the next 5, 10, 20, maybe 50 years, all right? With iterations perhaps, but not the big block of work to design them. Archetypes need strong governance. That's the other thing. So they need to be strongly governed. We need to know exactly what's happening with versions, revisions, all those kinds of things, because once they're implemented, any change has downstream effects for the implementers. So this is an example of the ubiquitous blood pressure. If you talk to anyone around open air in the world, they'll say the first archetype they saw is blood pressure. So I'm not going to break that tradition. This is in a tool called the Archetype Editor. It's the one that I use, but in fact there are a number of archetype editors that are now coming online. In fact, Eric's involved in some software development with a new one that's coming through now. So this is just one of the tools that we use to create the archetype and to edit it. This is the same archetype, but it's in a different tool. This is in the Clinical Knowledge Manager, which we're going to be showing you today. So this is an online tool, so it's exactly the same code that's sitting behind it. It's just displayed in a slightly different way. And this is the same one as well. All right, so again, it's the same code sitting behind it, but we're showing it as a mind map. And I've been able to show that to clinicians in corridor consultations, and they're able to say, you're missing this and you're missing that, and you look at it and they're right. So this is where if we can detechnify things, we can let every clinician who's an expert at what they do every day be able to actually pick up where we've got things wrong, help us correct it and so on. So there's enormous value in doing something even so simple. Now we've got a number of different types of archetypes. So the first one are compositions. Right? And compositions are the equivalent of a blank piece of paper. All right? So effectively it's like, you know, the paper in a paper record with a bit of colour coding down the side. It's things like reports or a prescription or a consultation note, that kind of thing. The next type of archetype we have are called sections. There's actually no clinical content in them specifically. They're just used as headings. So imagine them as headings on a blank piece of paper. It's a way that we start to organise the clinical content. Then we've got entries. So entries are where most of the clinical content is, plus smaller archetypes called clusters. But this is designed to really give you an idea that we're following the kind of processes that clinicians use. So the first one is these observations, which is the evidence, if you like, the things that we measure, touch, feel. Clinical history is also involved in that. And then the second type, called evaluations, are where we interpret the evidence, if you like. So we turn something that's a history and the examination findings and my test results, and I think the patient has this, a problem diagnosis, or an adverse reaction, or something like that. The next two go together as instructions and actions. So instructions are the orders, and the actions are about how we actually carry those orders out. So if a clinician is standing by the end of the bed saying, I would like this patient to start on the medication, the matching action would say, this medication for amoxicillin, 250 grams 3 times a day, is planned. And then when the resident sends it to the pharmacy, it's been sent. When it's dispensed, it's in a dispensed state. So we can actually track what's happening with that order to actually see if it's been completed, given to the patient, whether we had to abandon it because they had an allergic reaction, all those kinds of things. So there's different types of archetypes for different purposes. So this is exactly the same. This is what we've just seen before, but so you can compare and contrast. The templates allow us to flexibly express what the clinicians need. So these are rigid and fixed, if you like, but the templates allow us to organise things in a way that meets a specific clinical purpose. So for a message or a document or a form, and it's what is relevant for that clinician with that patient in that clinical context. All right? So we make sure that the clinician is only seeing the data that they want. The maximal data set sits behind it, but we actually only show them what's sensible for that use case. Okay? So we take the maximal data set and make it relevant. It can take anything from 1 to, well, a Google of archetypes per template. I've built some templates that have about 70 components to them, maybe 1 or 2 data elements from each of those archetypes, maybe all that's in them, but it gives us the clinical flexibility to represent the antenatal visit, which is what I was building at the time. And the notion of governance is not nearly so critical for templates, yet it's absolutely imperative for our archetypes. So this is a blurry image of the template designer, which in fact I'll show you in a little while, so I might skip that. But each of these bold black headings is an archetype. So each of these components here are the data elements, and you can see that these black ones are actually active. These greyed out ones, we call them, are actually ones that we've turned off for this use case. So this in fact is a teleotology assessment. So this is a template of data that's being sent to an ENT surgeon who is not on site. He's receiving photos and videos from clinicians who've actually been in remote outback Australia, and he's looking at the images. So the ones we've turned off are these ones around things like he can't tell what the smell is. He can't tell whether things are red and swollen and tender because he can't touch them, he can't feel them. Okay, so those are irrelevant to him in the situation he's in, but he can tell some of these other things and he can report back on the photos and images he sees. So in that way, we're actually turning something that would be all turned on for the clinicians who are face-to-face with the patient, but in this situation, we've just left the ones that are useful to this particular person. So, template complexity. We could have the Millennium Falcon version, multiple concepts, something that's very complex. We might have our little dinky helicopter that's just got a few archetypes in it for some very simple purpose. There's also this notion of, if we think about the helicopter as being the equivalent of a transfer of care summary, maybe this is an orthopaedic discharge summary, right? Standard neck or femur fracture, patient goes home, no problems. Maybe this is one where you had a complication, so there's a few more archetypes, slightly different colours, slightly different configuration, different shape to represent the clinical content that's required for that discharge summary. And this might be one where the patient ended up in ICU, very specialised, different components. Perhaps these ones are nursing ones. Different colour. I don't know, I had to think of another story to fit with these, but perhaps this is something, again, that's very simple. Here we've got a scenario of transfer of care that might have a lot more clinical information that needs to be imported or exported and is transferred. This might be something very simple. Maybe it's something like a patient admitted for respite care, didn't need a lot of acute care, so you've got very simple components to that one. And maybe this is just where there's a note that's been said the patient arrived, got sutured, sent home, goes to their primary care clinician. Another little discharge summary, all helicopters, but different flavours, different permutations and combinations, if you like. So just one way of just trying to get an idea of how the component building blocks can get reused to create similar things, but with slightly different permutations and combinations. So that little helicopter is actually made up of 10 building blocks. Okay, and they can be reconfigured. All right, if that's a discharge summary, that can be reconfigured into this one, which then might be a consultation note. Same archetypes, slightly different configuration, different levels of detail, but the building blocks are consistent all the way through. Okay, that's where we get the flexibility and the reuse of the archetypes. So archetypes for little data is really important. It does require a change of mindset, and that's where it gets people a bit anxious. So people say, if you've got to design the archetypes, then it's going to slow everything down. And yes and no. It does require some upfront planning and coordination. But once you get a reasonable amount of those core archetypes in place, it actually gets very, very fast to be able to use them. I think I'm losing my microphone here. That's better. So it requires clinician leadership. It is not an optional extra. We need our clinicians absolutely driving this to ensure we've got quality of data, to make sure it's safe and fit for purpose in our health records. And there is a potential role for some of the professional colleges, in fact, to take some leadership here. I haven't seen it happen yet, but I would love to see that start to evolve in the future. So we're talking about machine interpretable data. That's what we're doing. Structured messages, standardised content. It's called Level 4 Semantic Interoperability, and it's where clinical information that's recorded by one system can be transmitted to a receiving system, and that receiving system can know exactly what it means. There is no transformations, there's no interpretation required. It can actually do things computably with that data as though it had been created within that health record itself. That's what we're aiming for. And up until now, we haven't been able to do level 4 because we haven't had standardised content. We've just had standardised messages. So this is where we're getting the change, and the notion of being able to exchange granular information is starting to get very real. We also have this notion of an ecosystem with openEHR. So you've got this reference model underpinning everything, but this is where the magic happens. One of my colleagues says that archetypes get all the glory, but templates do all the work. And there's some truth in that, but both of them are absolutely necessary for all of this to work. But if you get that area in that pink circle right, then what you can do is, with terminology as well, is to generate all of this. all right? And you generate all of these things consistently. So we can generate queries, HTML display messages, data sets, and so on. The HL7 world has started down here, right? With HL7 version 2, that's where they're operating, not back here. And they can't generate consistent data sets and queries and so on because they're working in a messaging paradigm. So that's where it's really important to understand the value of this is phenomenal. Okay? All of the other things become orders of magnitude easier if we get the archetypes and templates right at the core. Does that make sense? So the terminologies, we're agnostic. I don't particularly care what the terminologies are. They could be local ones, SNOMED, LOINC, FEST in Norway, ICD, whatever you like. They all add value. It can be queries for one record, so queries into a patient's record or potentially queries across multiple records for population health. You can actually create one query that would be able to go across the whole population's health records that would be basically a national standard in a way that we haven't been able to do before. We can actually use the archetypes to build version 2, CDA, fire messages potentially. There's a lot of work happening around all of those things. There's a standard in Australia, in fact, about archetypes in version 2. And we're talking about health records, data registries, whatever kinds of data sets that you want. So is it achievable? I hear the skeptics asking very reasonably. 10 to 20 archetypes could change a life. All right, could save a life if we've got emergency information about the right things around adverse reactions, medications, problems, those kinds of things. Maybe 50 to 100 archetypes are really all we need for primary care health records, something quite simple. If we're looking at a full hospital EHR, maybe 2,000, but we're not talking about one archetype for every diagnosis. We're talking about one archetype for a problem diagnosis, and then we use terminology to give us the 50, 70,000 types of diagnoses we have and so on. So that's how it works together. We need terminology with the archetypes and then expressed in the flexible templates to give us the kind of structure that we want. This is the info structure. So what we're doing at the moment is very much this. We're getting the clinical core content right. The things that are used ubiquitously, all right? So we've spent a year now working on the adverse reaction archetype. In fact, we're doing it in conjunction with the fire people from HL7. It's taken us probably 14, 15 months. I think we're about to publish it this week. But what that means is it can be reused in all sorts of different use cases all across the world potentially. There may be different tweaks that are required by some of the national programs, but we've designed it in a way that can be extended for particular reporting requirements and all sorts of things. So we've designed it as cleverly as we can to have the core content that would be common across everybody's use cases and allow it to be extended in particular scenarios. What we do is we use this thing called the Clinical Knowledge Manager, or CKM. And in fact, it's starting to become a verb. People are talking about we'll CKM it, which is kind of interesting. So there's an international one and a number of national programs have a CKM. And we run these review programs for each archetype. So we can actually get consensus, which means we can publish it as being correct and fit for use within weeks per archetype. We don't have to pull people together from all over the country in face-to-face meetings. That's expensive and takes clinicians away from their practice. So they can actually do it with a glass of wine after dinner and the kids are in bed. They can do their review, might take 10, 20 minutes, something like that per archetype. And we can run multiple ones in parallel. So if we have modest resources, we can actually be quite agile with this and get quite a lot of work done quite quickly. We're also leveraging everyone else's work. The work that we develop, we'll share with anybody openly, and we're able to actually then share other people's work and bring it into our environment, translate where necessary, and actually start to sort of leverage all of this sensibly. Can clinicians agree? That was the question that was asked of me, or the CEO of HL7, who is a clinician, and he's very sceptical when I said we're actually getting consensus. And he said, rubbish, what's a heart attack? 5 clinicians, 6 answers. He's probably right. Okay, they all argue about how you define what a heart attack might be. And the other thing that's been going on, I'm not bagging HL7, it's just they've been going at it longer than we have. They've been arguing for a long time the difference between an issue and a problem and a diagnosis. Right? 20 years, I reckon, they must have been doing it for, because I've been hearing about it for about 15. They can't decide. All right? Because It's a continuum, effectively, all right? There's kind of a range that clinicians start with something that might be an issue, and then you get more evidence and so on, and finally you get diagnostic criteria that are met and you have a formal diagnosis. So do you need different ways to define it? And we've worked out ways to try and address that. This is largely a human problem, though. It's about communication, it's about people working together to actually achieve this consensus. But what we have done is that we've worked on the structure of these things. That's what we've got in the archetypes. It's not the name of the heart attack or the proper title for a particular ECG finding and history and examination findings and so on. But we have worked out that we've got a problem diagnosis name that we need to record, and a status and a date of onset, an age of onset, a severity and so on. These are the sort of things that clinicians learn in the first week of nursing school, medical school. It's in your textbooks. It's all of those kinds of basic patterns about how you think about recording a diagnosis or a symptom or something similar. That is what we're archetyping, the patterns, all right, not the value sets. The value sets, what goes in this thing here, this is what comes from SNOMED and ICD and so on. And that's probably the harder thing to get clinicians to agree on. So I'm glad I'm not actually doing that. So in the background, just one slide on the openEHR Foundation. This is a not-for-profit organisation that's hosted by University College London. It's managed by UCL at the moment. All of the specifications and everything is freely available. It's open source. So the techies can go and read that to their heart's content. It's been probably a bit of a cottage industry, really, for a long, long time. In the last 12 to 18 months, it's starting to get into a much more serious place. In February this year, we had elections for the management board for the first time. We have expert volunteers managing the operational side of things. Eric's one of these. Celia and I are doing another part. So it's starting to kind of take on more of a structure, although this is still volunteer, it's not resourced. There's a growing and active industry group, and they have actually funded the first bit of work recently around the archetype development, because there are 6 vendors who want these core archetypes locked down, published, so they can all start to use the same information models. So I think Cambio's in the room. They're one of the group that's involved in that. So we've got commercial and open source implementations based on these archetypes. It doesn't have to be all open source implementation. And there is a large international community that's sitting behind all of this, the technical side of things, all of the clinical side as well. I'm going to show you some figures around the clinical community, but I actually have no idea of the size of the international community who communicate on their list servers and so on. So we're always surprised. We're at MedInfo in Brazil a couple of months ago, and there was a massive implementation in China that nobody had heard about. So they've built a system very quietly, all by themselves, using our archetypes that are freely available, and this was the first time anyone had met them, talked to them, or even knew that this system existed. So there's a whole lot of stuff that's just starting to creep out that we're actually finding that's bigger than we thought. Again, just to make sure that you don't think this is just a kind of clinical thing, I don't understand this, all right? I won't pretend to. This is the bit of the specifications that we're talking about. The rest of it are the representations of all of the other technical things that are sitting behind. So we're talking about today a very limited component of what the openEHR specifications are. So if you're looking for a very robust architecture for health records, it's there. It's just I'm not the person to talk about it. Eric loves it. That's right. So what have we got? We are developing data structures that are independent of technology and applications, all right? Effectively the universal health record. Breaking our data out of silos, all right, that have been created by the vendors. The potential for lifelong health information now is becoming real, all right, where it hasn't been before. We've had to do transformations between various health records as one dies and needs to get upgraded and so on. It caters for clinical diversity, caters for dynamic knowledge, supports data liquidity, enables reuse of health information. It's multilingual, right, and there's no language primacy, so we can have archetypes built in Swedish, translated to English, Norwegian, Portuguese, Farsi, whatever you like it to be, and vice versa. It's terminology agnostic, so we can use any of your local terminologies or something like ICD or SNOMED as well. We don't particularly care. This is the final image that I've got, and the idea is really that what we're trying to do is get a core group of people who are highly trained to build archetypes that are cohesive, that work together effectively, an international source of truth, or a national library of cohesive models, all right? We don't expect everyone to be able to build really good high-quality archetypes. But I think what we do expect is that people will consume those archetypes and build them into templates, all right, in a distributed way. So anybody should be able to build a template relatively simply. It doesn't, half a day of training, and you should be able to actually build that. And if we start to get national templates that we publish, we can actually start to share it. So people don't start from scratch. They can just tweak it. They can just say, my clinician needs to see this level of detail, so I'll expose that or I'll hide something. But in fact, you've got the starting point, perhaps 90% there. And that will just help this distributed notion of the templates to reflect the clinical diversity, but the national program or the international program controls and manages and governs these central core archetypes as the starting point. Does that make sense? Sort of? You get the idea? So that's basically where we are. Eric asked me to do a quick demonstration. How much time have we got?
20 minutes, I think.
My goodness, I never do it so quickly. So it literally has been a flying visit. Now, let me see if I can... So I haven't got this on my computer in front of me, so I'm going to have to do it from here with all my wires attached, if I can take them around here. This is the template designer that we use at the moment. And in that right-hand side, we have the archetype library. All right, so you can see, if I close that down, we've got compositions. Remember, they were the blank pieces of paper. Sections are the headings. Entries are where we get the clinical content, as well as the clusters. And we're not going to worry about structures and elements because I don't use them. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a template in here, just on the fly, just to show you, based on what we've currently got with our current archetypes, how we might represent a clinical document or a visit and so on. So at about 5 minutes to midnight last night, Eric sent me an email and said, what about doing something around diabetes? And I've been practicing something else and I had it all kind of ready to go. So let's give diabetes a go based on what we've got. So I thought we might do an encounter or a visit, a clinical visit. So I have just grabbed a composition archetype called an encounter. So you can see over here, all of these archetypes are the kinds of things you'd expect to see at a piece of paper level, if you like, in a paper record. So we've got prescription, we've got problem list, we've got obstetric history. They're big, broad topics, but in fact there's not a lot of content. All we've got are these things called slots really in here. This is the key thing. And it's a bit like a lock and key. This is the thing that holds all of the information. So in fact, the encounter composition archetype is really just a bucket, right, that can contain all of the clinical content. But in openEHR, we need a composition in order to be able to save any health record information into the health record itself. So I can build templates that don't have compositions, but I won't be able to save it. So we always have a composition if we want it to go into the health record. So then I'm going to create a framework, if you like, by using these sections. So there's a few things here that might be useful. You can see even I had the antenatal run ready to go. In fact, let's just show that, even though it's not relevant. This antenatal one has, again, more slots, but you can see it's just headings. And it's just these little places where I can drop more information. So think about this as headings on a blank piece of paper that just give you the structure, and then you're going to start to fill in the detail. So that's a nice, neat one, but I'm going to delete that one, and I'm going to get messy with some of these others. So let's start with, I'm going to have a problem list. In fact, this is going to be a specialist first consultation of a patient with diabetes by an ophthalmologist, all right? So they want to get a big picture about what's going on, the basic kinds of things. They want to know things about adverse reactions. They want to know perhaps some test result reports. They're going to have a conclusion at the end where they create a diagnosis and maybe some vital signs, all right? So this is giving us some slots and some headings, and I'm able to actually very quickly drop in an archetype because I know these have got set up that I can drop the problem diagnosis archetype in there, okay? But I'm going to get my headings ready first, and what I want to do is actually, I'm going to add something in here that's called ad hoc heading, and this is the way I actually build most of my templates. I'm just going to rename this, and this is going to be about my patient history. And then I'm going to drag that up the top so that now I've got my history, okay? I've got my problem list, adverse reaction list. Then I'm going to do some examination findings, and I think I want to drop that in the middle somewhere. So let's just put that perhaps up in here before I do my conclusion. And I'm going to call that my exam findings. So there's no semantics in this. That's why I can just rename it. I am just creating headings and a structure, okay? My exam findings, and I'm going to drop my vital signs. Can you see how that's turned green? All right, it's valid for that archetype to be dropped in there. The others are grey, it's not going to let me drop it in there, but this one, it's allowed to go. So in fact, I can actually have my vital signs now sitting under my exam finding. So you can see how I can just start to build my headings and my layers. Then I can come in here and I'm going to drop in the story archetype, which is what we use for our narrative, our clinical narrative. And I can drop, let's just drag it, drop it over here. And I know that that's the only data element that's available. It's a free text data element, but here's a slot that I can put more structured detail. And this is where I can put my symptoms and signs, all right? Reported symptoms and signs from the patient. So there's quite a long structure in there that's just been published about how we represent common symptoms and signs, and we would use terminology to express what the name of that symptom sign is. But we can say it's nil significant, so it's nausea or it's tinnitus or it's some other symptom, pain. We can say nil significant, or we can describe it. We can put the body site in. We can even get more structured archetypes in around the anatomical location. So we can drag that one into here so we can actually describe much more detail where it actually was. All sorts of things around that. Let's continue. We've got problem diagnosis. We can also put a procedure in as part of our problem list. So any operations, any diagnoses. We can drop in our adverse reaction archetype. We're ready to go. We can put in some of our lab reports. So in fact, this is all about to be revamped. So these are probably a little bit out of date in the next couple of months. But let's put our, what have we got? Blood glucose if we're doing diabetes. I think there was a hemoglobin A1C too, wasn't there? There we are. We'll drop that one in as well. We can pop in our vital signs, our blood pressure archetype. And we can put in, again, our pulse. Can you see how quickly I'm starting to build quite structured data? It's been built once, the archetype, it's been agreed, and now we're able to reuse it in this context in just this kind of way. I can also find my physical diagnosis archetype where I actually record the sort of touchy-feely part of examination, and I'm going to drop that into the exam finding as well. So in fact, when you close this down a little bit, you'll see where these bold black headings are. You've got physical exam findings. I'm going to put that just above the vital signs. Then I've got the heading, and then I've got my vital sign archetypes in there. If I open this up, again, we've designed it so we can start to do this fractal nature of recording examination, because every doctor does it differently, every nurse does it differently. If you're trying to combine it and make it for doctors, nurses, physiotherapists, anyone else, then we need this notion of being able to nest things in various permutations and combinations, if you like. So I'm going to look here for my exam archetypes, and you'll see we've started to develop quite a few of them, and I'm going to find the one around both eyes, and I'm going to drag that in here. So I can record the detail in a description, and then I can start to put in my examination of both eyes, which includes are they symmetrical, etc. And then I know that I can slot in the examination of one eye, so we go into the detail of just one eye itself. And then I know that that's been designed so that we can actually get all of the various components of an eye we can drop in. So we can then examine the pupil, and we can examine the lens. Can you see how this is actually really quite a simple way for people to be able to start to construct things? If we get the archetype foundation right, then we get the ability to build quite a complex record very quickly. Now, if I expand my branch right from the top here, that's going to open up every single data element, and we can scroll down here, and you can see the level of detail, right? These are all the maximal data sets. So what I'm going to do now is then show you what we can do with this. Here we've got little values, all right, that have been put into the archetype. So the eye examined has actually got values of left and right. So in fact, let's just say I only want to examine the left eye for whatever reason. It's not to make a lot of sense clinically, but let's just do that because we can. We're going to allow the clinician to say no abnormality detected, because if they say it's no abnormality detected, you'd expect the user interface to shut down and all the other data elements would be disappeared and you'd move on to the next component of the health record. So it allows that shortcut to happen. Or we can allow a free text clinical description. Here we've got shape. It actually has the pupil shapes that have been put into the archetype. So in fact, we can reduce all of those, and we'll say we only want circular and oval for our use case. So we've just diminished it so that we've only got those two values. We're going to turn off size, and we might turn off some of these. So I'm setting these to 0 occurrence. Can you see how they're turning grey? So I'm turning them off in my use case because this particular clinician is not doing these, doesn't believe in it, whatever reason it might be. Maybe they haven't got the equipment. They can actually then start to configure it. So the only active data elements are these 4. So I'm going to continue to turn some of these off. I could put more detailed examination findings in there if I want, but I don't. And what I'm going to do is now show you how that actually gets expressed in a little mock-up form. And whenever I do live demonstrations, you know, my advice usually is don't do it. Sometimes it doesn't do what I expect it to do, but I'm crossing my fingers that it will. This is a little a demo, if you like, and it's not going to do that bit either. Normally we can open that up.
The HTML tree is pretty good.
Sorry?
The HTML tree thing is another.
So I'm going to drag this across here, and you can see that we've only got a few data elements here. So I have dragged the whole archetype across, but it's not expressing any of these things that have been greyed out. So we've got the eye examined, we've got no abnormality detected, clinical description and shape. So what I'm going to do now is just see if we can work a little bit of magic. This is just a demonstrator. So the eye examined is now limited to left because we took the right out. The clinical description is free text, and the shape is now being limited to circular and oval, which is what we set it up to be. Okay, so this is how I just wanted to sort of show you we can build and aggregate a document or a visit or something in just a few minutes, just like we did. And then for each of those archetypes, we would go back and we would constrain them further. We can make optional things mandatory. We can add value sets where it's just been free text. We can take value sets that have locked in the archetype and we can't add to them, but we can reduce them that's relevant for that clinician in that context and so on. So we don't get an archetype that's got 40 data elements like the blood pressure one, and you present every data element to that clinician and they're going to go, no way, right? I'm not doing this. You show them the ones that they need for that clinician in that clinical context, or that your organisation mandates for good quality care, or whatever it is that is your decision-making process, but you will not show them the maximal data set. The maximal data set is to allow everybody to have all the data elements so they can start to share them should they choose to. But basically you agree what levels you want to interoperate with as well. There's no magic about that. That's the human bit. This is just providing the information patterns to allow that kind of conversation to happen. All right, so it's a foundation for interoperability. It's not the silver bullet, but it's getting us a long way down that track that we haven't had before. I think I'll leave that there. For those people who are attending tomorrow's sessions as well, this is what we're going to go into in great detail, and you will be building this kind of thing at the end of the day.
Okay. So let's open for questions. I'll try to run around with this microphone. You need to raise your hand if we're going to see your question. While you're thinking, could you say that when I was talking about taking reality and putting it into some kind of boxes, for the archetypes, the task of the clinician is to make sure that everything can be captured, and when it comes to the templates, you want to make sure that you don't have to capture the things that are relevant for you. So
that's right.
So you have two different tasks to do to make sure you get what you want. It's okay to ask questions in Swedish also.
So thank you very much for a very interesting presentation, first of all. Well, we have this demonstration open. I just want to ask you, we see some quite complex archetypes here, for example, examination of an eye, and there's also an examination of both eyes. So I just want to ask you, on the technical side of things, will the system know that if I fill in something about an examination of one eye, will the information stored about that, know that it will be
Absolutely
similar. Yeah.
They're completely different paths and so on. So each of these data elements, in fact, has a unique identifier within each archetype. So again, we can be very clear that the eye examination, or I examined within the context of an examination of the lens, if that was just standalone, we would know what that meant. But we would also know about the eye examined within the context of any of those archetypes that are eye-related. We would have that as the pattern. Sometimes that might be redundant in actual fact with our modelling because you've already identified the eye right at the top. But you can be absolutely clear that that's the case. The other thing would be with something like a blood pressure archetype. Sometimes you would have things called events. So in fact, you want to be able to identify that a blood pressure that was recorded just as part of a clinic visit or a triage situation was quite different to the systolic blood pressure that was recorded as part of a 24-hour monitoring sequence of data collections. And so there is the ability to be able to distinguish, even though it's one model, between the different contexts of how that data is actually being collected. So your question, absolutely, probably to more detail than you could imagine, the ability to be able to record sequences of data collections like the blood pressure machine in intensive care or over intervals of time, all those sorts of things are certainly available and it's very explicit.
Okay, there's a question down in the corner.
I'm a politician, so I'm not so into the technical part of it, but I'm curious about how far has this approach with archetypes and templates been developed in other industries, businesses, or areas of where very complex data is used?
I'm not sure that I'm the most qualified person to speak. I mean, Eric, you might be better off to comment about where it's done elsewhere. I can say that there, in fact, in the reference model, there is nothing, or there might be one thing that's health specific. And in fact, our company has actually developed an anti-money laundering system with archetypes and templates. So we've in fact applied something that's been designed for the complexity of health to other domains. But what happens in other domains as common practice? Do you want to comment on that?
This is created for treating persons of different ways. So I guess this is designed to handle a lot of complexity. So if you don't have that complexity in the domain that you want to use it for, then this could be overly complex. But if your main problem is maintenance and getting agreement among a lot of things like clinicians, then this is relevant. So I would guess like social care and things like this would work pretty fine, but for many technical situations you have other models. So it's a tool created for a specific environment, so I'm not sure it would be a perfect fit for all kinds of businesses. But you see similar ways of thinking, that you have a basic model and then you've got different levels of meta models above it, like something like archetypes and something like templates. You can see that in many systems. So it's not a unique idea, and you can look also in the old, the normal EHR systems that we use now, they have something like templates also, and it's probably something simpler than archetypes. In Swedish we have sökord and mallar, things like that. So it's not a completely unique idea, it's mostly that it's been refined over the years. This is like 20 years of research and trying and experimenting and refining and doing this.
The other thing I was going to say is that this approach of building the archetypes, having the clinicians lead this, is quite unique in health. And there are a number of national programs who are looking at that, not because they believe in openEHR as the solution for implementation, but they believe that what we've got here with this ability to engage with clinicians and actually to get them to contribute is unique, that none of the other standards organisations have really been able to do. In HL7, the father of HL7, Ed Hammond, has been trying for probably 30 years to try to get clinicians engaged in building some of the HL7 models, and he bemoans the fact that in fact it's been very, very difficult and doesn't feel he's been particularly successful, and came and saw this and his eyes were afire. He was very excited. It's funny I said a fire. There's a number of programs, and certainly in Australia there is a momentum gathering at national level. In the UK, HSCIC, their standards organisation, they are using this approach to get clinicians engaged, but they're looking to create fire resources as the way to implement it. So what I can see is, there's the technical side of things with openEHR that people choose for various reasons, but in fact the unique part of what we're doing with the clinician engagement is applicable across all sorts of formalisms, all sorts of standards. And so my ideal would be to get archetypes agreed here and then potentially getting FHIR resources that are consistent, getting UML models that are consistent, getting all sorts of ways to actually implement them, but the actual clinical content is aligned. That would be a little bit of magic that I think would actually really transform healthcare.
And I think one thing that is important to think that don't think openEHR is the holy grail for anything, but if you're looking for a solution to tackle this problem, it should have kind of the same qualities and have the same possibility of getting clinicians engaged in details. If you have that, then well, it doesn't matter if it's openEHR or whatever, but look for the same qualities and this versioning that you can handle the complexity over time. So this is not a sales thing, and it shouldn't be an HL7 bashing thing.
No, it's not intended.
But
they're the ones that have been around forever. And
yes, they have a lot of experience.
Exactly.
And
I would love to see these standards organisations actually collaborating so that we can create the HL7 standards in using the clinical content that we've got to have the alignment. So it's about everybody playing in the same sandpit, and I think that would be very exciting if we could do that.
See a lot of alignment coming here.